Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. It is Friday, October 17th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. How you doing, Jacob?
Hi, Jessica. Good to be with you again.
Good to be with you as well. It is day 742 of the war. As families held funerals for the hostage bodies returned to Israel, Hamas claimed it is working hard to hand over all of the captives' remains and claimed in the latest headline that it needed equipment to clear the rubble. We'll talk about what is happening in this stage of this ceasefire, U.S. statements, U.S. President Trump and his comments, as well as the public executions that have been carried out by the terrorist group inside the Gaza Strip. We'll also talk about what is happening with the governance in Gaza after the war is over. Stay with us. Okay, so Jacob, let's first tackle: is Hamas violating its deal? The U.S. says no. You have a very involved piece with a lot of commentary from different sources. Tell us what you're hearing, and let's first start with what is there's the denial, but why? In other words, what is the overall comment that you're getting here?
Sure. So far, Hamas has returned 9 bodies of hostages. They actually returned a 10th, but it ended up being a body of a Palestinian from the West Bank who was reportedly helping the IDF in scanning tunnels in Gaza, and he was later killed by Hamas for collaborating and sent back to Israel along as if he was a hostage, and quite a statement, definitely maybe sending a message to other Palestinians about how they will be the narrative of their death if they do collaborate with Israel, and also just clearly violating the deal in that regard. But notably, so of course you've had Israel come out and say that this 9 is not 28, which is the number of bodies that were still in Gaza when this deal entered into place. And while we do recognize that it might be difficult for Hamas to get all 28, maybe it ends up being something closer to 20 or 25. But the idea that they started with 4 and then gave another 3 and then another 2, that is simply inexcusable to Israel. And that was why it was quite surprising, because the U.S. has been rather in lockstep with Israel throughout the war, at least in the Trump administration. So to hear 2 senior Trump advisors, there was a briefing that was held on Tuesday with a small group of journalists in the U.S. And to hear them pretty much fall in line completely with the Hamas position, which is that no, they're actually doing everything they can to try to get the bodies out. It's a very difficult process. The amount of debris in Gaza to try to dig under and find these bodies. One of the senior advisors likens the situation to 9/11 and the amount of rubble and debris and destruction that was at the World Trade Center. And think obviously you're going to have to multiply that by quite a few numbers in order to.
Right, a city compared to buildings, right?
Exactly, in Gaza. But the argument is just, look, it's going to take time. We don't believe that Hamas is dragging its feet on this, and that we just want, if Israel believes that Hamas is dragging its feet, what we're telling Israel right now is give us the information that you have, the intelligence that you have of where exactly certain bodies are. We'll pass that along to Hamas, and then we'll challenge them to see if then they're unable to go to specific areas and get these bodies out, then we can have a different discussion. But it's not just Israel that needs to go at this alone. The U.S. is saying actually that you have countries like Turkey, which is a very poor relationship right now with Israel, but they're actually offering to send a whole team of rescuers who have a lot of experience dealing with earthquakes and pulling bodies from rubble in earthquakes, that they could play a real important role in Gaza as well. That's how the U.S. sees it, and there are other countries as well. Egypt is also offering to send a team. But for now, Israel's been pushing back on having other international forces in Gaza to try to carry out this mission, and they want simply Hamas to come up with the bodies. But that was not how the U.S. saw it in this briefing, and even publicly, you had Caroline Leavitt say it's going to take time. We're committed to getting every single body. We're not going to leave anyone behind. But we're not willing to say that the Hamas at this stage has violated the ceasefire. And that could be because they genuinely believe that Hamas has not violated a ceasefire, or I think there's also a feeling that at this stage they're not ready to see this thing collapse, and they don't want it to see it collapse on an issue like this. There's expected to be much more difficult discussions about demilitarization that haven't really even begun. But on this issue, I think it's just too early. Trump is still basking in the glory of this very impressive ceasefire that he was able to broker, getting all those live hostages out. And I think they're not at this stage willing to say, okay, Israel, you have the green light to go back in. They are saying they're willing to give that green light if they feel that Hamas is violating the deal. But at this stage, they're not at that place yet.
Jacob, as Laser and I discussed yesterday, you know, there I think there's a difference here. You know, you have the glory, as you just spoke about, in terms of President Trump's feelings about brokering the deal. You have the glory of 20 living hostages, and it is absolutely amazing as we all see and are watching them returning to their lives. But you also have these families that are just desperate to have some sense of closure and to bury their person, to have a grave. So is it that the US doesn't necessarily, the Trump administration doesn't necessarily see this piece of the puzzle as important, as essential as the living hostages? Because, in other words, the longer we go without finding those bodies, we all know the longer it could be. We all have a sense that it could not happen at some point.
No, not at all. I think they're pretty adamant. Steve Witkoff spoke about this on Thursday evening at an event at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, that this is something they're completely committed to until the very last one. He recognizes that he had hoped that all of the bodies would have come out on Monday with the living hostages. That hasn't happened, but that doesn't mean that the U.S. is moving on this issue. They are trying to move on with this hostage deal, and they're trying to get to or the ceasefire agreement. They're trying to get what they're calling phase two. Phase one was basically the first 8 points or so of Trump's plan, and they got agreements between Israel and Hamas on basically the initial withdrawal of Israeli forces, the ceasefire itself, the hostage prisoner exchange, and the humanitarian aid provisions. What was not agreed upon is what they're calling phase two, but that's on all these thornier issues like demilitarization, the international stabilization force that will be coming into Gaza. And those were some of the things that were also talked about in this briefing on Tuesday. What is a little bit tricky is that I think what Trump has been successful at has been willing this deal and kind of bullying the parties to get to a yes on this deal. But when it comes to the details, I don't think a lot of these players are as sharp on them. And there's talk of Trump in one of his tweets this week talks about how phase two is already beginning, where phase two has begun. But they haven't had an agreement on phase two. There is no agreement on demilitarization or on international stabilization force or who exactly the technocratic government will be in Gaza. Those discussions haven't really even begun yet. And I think Israel's in this quandary of whether to allow those to begin because it does have an interest in those talks happening. On the other hand, they don't want to. Israel feels that if you move on with other parts of the deal, then maybe you're neglecting the hostages or the bodies of the hostages that are still in Gaza. I think what the U.S. is trying to argue is that we can do both things at the same time, and we don't want to allow the bodies issue to bog down other issues. So some of the other things that were talked about relatedly in this briefing that I thought were pretty headline worthy was one that there's these executions that we'll talk a little bit about later, but that are the U.S. idea is actually to have cooperation with Israel to create safe zones inside the areas that the IDF is controlling in Gaza, which is basically about 50% of the strip, a little bit more. And in those areas, Palestinians trying to flee Hamas retribution are able to flee. And that's something that was talked about for the first time in this briefing, and we'll see if that actually advances. Israel's yet to confirm that publicly. The U.S. is doing so for the first time, but that was one thing that was new. Another thing that came to that I noted was the talk about demilitarization of the Gaza Strip and this idea that they're talking about trying to condition the redevelopment of Gaza on or only limiting the redevelopment of Gaza on to areas where that are considered quote unquote Hamas free or terror free. So they're going to try to focus right now, starting with Rafah, is what one of the senior Trump advisors said. We're going to try to rebuild Rafah up in the southern Gaza Strip. That will be kind of a model for what maybe the broader strip can look like. and it will marginalize Hamas by showing Palestinians, I guess, the areas that are under Hamas's control. They might get humanitarian aid, but they don't get the same kind of reconstruction that other places like Rafah could get. So that was another interesting headline. Then, in terms of the ISF, this International Stabilization Force that the plan envisions, if there's an agreement, phasing out the IDF and hopefully working to disarm Hamas. Some of the countries that were named for the first time, Indonesia, they talked about that before. That was the first one that the senior advisor talked about. But actually, Azerbaijan was thrown out for the first time, at least that I've heard from a U.S. official, saying it's expressing interest in it's contributing troops or support to this ISF. A couple last two things I'll mention was on the issue of Gazans being allowed to stay in the Strip during the reconstruction process. This is something that actually isn't so new, but I think it's been reporters, it seems like, who don't cover this very closely, love to ask this question anytime that the issue comes up in briefings. Will Gazans be allowed to stay? I guess it has to do with this February Gaza Lago Riviera plan that got stuck in a lot of people's heads, where the idea was to actually force Gazans to leave. Now there was absolute wall-to-wall opposition to that in the international community besides for the Israel. And I think you saw Trump abandon it. And this plan, the 20-point plan, actually from several weeks ago, talks about that Gazans will be encouraged to live and remain in Gaza. And so for some reason, I guess the reporters on this call didn't get that memo, but they asked about it, and the senior advisor says, no, we're not forcing anyone to leave. I think kind of capping off this about face that this advisor even it was interesting to hear him talk about how, well, we don't feel like it's a very livable place, but we're clearly seeing how Palestinians want to live there, and we're going to allow them to do so and even encourage it, which is a real shift from what you had at the beginning of the administration when Steve Witkoff said it's uninhabitable and therefore people should leave. So a real shift there that's taken place. And lastly is on the issue of the Palestinian Authority, where I thought there was an interesting, a real criticism from one of the senior advisors on this call, basically saying that they want to rely on Palestinians that are currently in the diaspora to stand up this technocratic government, this transitional body of independent Palestinian experts that will be running the Strip in the immediate aftermath of the war, rather than relying on the Palestinian Authority, which they argue is corrupt. And why I thought that was noteworthy, coming just a couple days after actually Trump embraced Palestinian Authority, President Mahmoud Abbas in Sharm el-Sheikh, and they had a friendly conversation there. He was invited to take part in this conference with world leaders, and it seemed like there was a new page being turned between the U.S. and the PA. But clearly there are still some voices in the administration who are not so comfortable with Ramallah's presence in this effort. I think it's going to be an ongoing discussion. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of pressure from Arab parties in the region to include Ramallah. They don't feel like it should be left out because that's kind of the key to getting a pathway to a two-state solution. But clearly this is going to be a longer discussion, because I think while there is talk in the 20-point plan of creating a pathway to a two-state solution, when you actually talk with President Trump, he has said it as well, that actually he claims that the plan doesn't talk about it, even though it's in there black and white, or that he hasn't made a decision on it. And one of the senior advisors is similarly talking in this briefing about that. It clearly indicates that those 2 points in the 20-point plan were put there mainly to kind of just placate the Arab parties to get their support, and then they kind of ignore it afterwards. So we'll have to see if the Arab parties manage to convince the Trump administration to actually get behind this effort. But those were the things that I noticed in this briefing that was quite interesting.
Okay. Let's take a pause here, Jacob, and go to break. When we're back, we'll talk about the public executions that have been carried out by Hamas in the Strip and a little bit more about post-war Gaza. So stay with us. Okay. So, Jacob, we had Trump claiming that this is back on Tuesday, which is, of course, eons ago at this point. He had claimed on Tuesday that he had given Hamas, quote, approval for a period of time to carry out the killings, And now, as you pointed out already in the first half of the podcast, the U.S. the Trump administration is turning away from that statement because, of course, we're seeing them being carried out on a regular basis. Where is the U.S. standing on this right now? These public executions taking place in the Gaza Strip by Hamas. Give us a sense of where the administration, how they're looking at it right now.
Yeah, I mean, these are some really gory, shocking scenes that are taking place and being filmed. Dozens of people have been killed over the past several days. And there continue to be reports of this happening mainly in northern Gaza and Gaza City, but also in other areas. And it was really shocking to hear President Trump on Tuesday talk about actually that he was basically greenlighting this, that was fine with this happening, that he likened these gangs or these Palestinians that were being targeted to very bad gangs that were maybe that the U.S. has to deal with or that other countries have to deal with. He had a similar approach to crime in Egypt. He was talking about how he loves how Sisi, who's criticized the president there as being this very authoritarian person who cracks down on any sort of protest, and he says, well, actually, Egypt doesn't have any crime. So he seems to have this outlook that he kind of attaches how the U.S. might approach crime to, I guess, any sort of violence in Gaza, and as a result seemed to be greenlighting this hard hand that Hamas had against either clans that these are not like pro-Israel clans. One of the clans that was involved that was targeted in the early days of these assassinations was actually involved in the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit many years ago, the IDF soldier. And so these are just people that have pushed back on Hamas's rule, feeling that they led Gaza in the wrong direction, and then other people that they claim to be as collaborators with Israel. But the initial U.S. response or Trump's response was to not embrace, but to greenlight it. And then I guess there was a quick about face. First, you had the head of U.S. CENTCOM, the head of U.S. forces in the Middle East, basically call on Hamas, issue a statement on Wednesday saying you must immediately stop these targeting of Palestinian civilians. And then Trump himself said, actually, I'm doing a little bit more research, and maybe this is gangs plus, whatever that means. Basically saying, okay, maybe these people aren't, the people being targeted are not deserving of being killed in this way. And then he had the more forceful tweet or a Truth Social post on Thursday where he says, if Hamas continues to kill people in Gaza, which was not the deal, we will have no choice but to go in and kill them. He says we, meaning that would imply that the U.S. is going in, and I think that was what some people jumped to that conclusion, justifiably so. But I spoke with a U.S. official who said, as in the past, Trump has liked to use the term we when really he means Israel. If you recall, there were times where he wanted to strike back at Iran, and he was actually saying, well, Israel will be the one to do it for us. And there was even an example where he used we for Gaza, and he said, actually, no, we're not going to be sending U.S. troops into Gaza. It will be Israel doing the work for us. But clearly, he's arguing that if these executions continue, he will give Israel a green light, at the very least, to start going after Hamas. So a very complete shift in his approach on this issue, recognizing that it's really quite inexcusable what Hamas is carrying out in Gaza over these past few days.
Okay. And then let's turn finally to another piece of yours about the slowed establishment of the post-war Gaza government. Your headline says that the slowed establishment of post-war Gaza fuels a Hamas revival. That's a warning from diplomats. And you talked about this a little bit in the first half of the podcast about, the technocrats that could possibly govern Hamas and who would they be and where would they come from. But talk to us a little bit about this piece, basically, which of course we will link to, that each Arab country that is involved in this and the people who are putting together the plan, the different agendas of each stakeholder in a sense. But essentially, really what's happening, it really leads back to everything that we've been speaking about, which is that the longer it takes to figure out who's going to lead Gaza, the more Hamas can just, go into that vacuum and, remain in place. So what are some of the efforts that the diplomats are making? And again, it goes back to what you were saying before. Phase 2 isn't being discussed yet, but does it make sense to be working on phase 2 even as we haven't completely finished phase 1?
Absolutely, I think it does. And I think these executions that have been taking place over the past week are further emphasis. Now, there's of the importance of getting this moving to phase 2 as quickly as possible. There's a recognition by some of the Arab and European diplomats that I spoke to for this piece that it made sense why the U.S. decided to split this deal in two and to focus on the easier part with the hostages first. It was the most urgent issue that the people whose lives were at stake. And these issues regarding who will govern Gaza, how will Hamas disarm, are really thorny and may not ever be agreed to. So let's focus on the things that we can get a yes on, and then maybe that will provide us momentum for the next stages. But what that caused is that without having any sort of government in place to start phasing out Hamas, is that now Hamas is the only really dominant power in Gaza. And that's what we're seeing in these past week, where they're able to regain control. They're patrolling streets in uniform or makeshift uniform and with guns. And there are probably several thousand to 10,000 or even more fighters that are kind of popping up out of tunnels and able to roam the streets and really induce a lot of fear and wreak havoc throughout the Strip. So what the U.S. and other mediators are trying to do is, in the meantime, even though there's not an agreement, or at least some sort of signed document between Israel and Hamas, there's overall acceptance. Hamas has said we're fine with not being the ones governing Gaza. They obviously do want to be the ones with the weapons and be able to carry out whatever they want behind the scenes. But Israel's also okay with having a technocratic Palestinian government, which is what the Trump plan talks about. No PA, no Hamas. We're fine with Palestinians being in there. So that even though if there's not an agreement on this, at least on paper, you could still move forward with this, putting together this independent government of Palestinian experts, technocrats, whatever you want to call it. And that's what the various parties are trying to go about doing and putting together this list. It'll be about, my understanding, of 12 to 16 names, and they'll act as pretty much ministers. And what's tricky about putting together this list, is that every stakeholder from Israel to the PA that wants to be linked to this body, even if they're not going to be actually the ones running Gaza, they want to be the ones to be handed over Gaza at some point. So they want to have good ties with this technocratic body. And then Qatar and Turkey and Egypt and the UAE, and some of them are Islamist and some of them are supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood and others are not. So they have very clashing views about what this body should look like. And a lot of these countries have financial interests. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner have massive amounts of financial interest in the Gulf states that are being asked to invest in the Gaza Strip. So this body that's being put together, and Tony Blair, the former UK Prime Minister, who's kind of representing the US, but also basically in charge of a lot of this process, is being pulled into all different sides by these various stakeholders to try to get who want their person on this body. And on top of that is this board of peace that President Trump will be chairing himself. And that's also going to be overseeing the technocratic government, basically maybe meeting every few months and giving some direction and orders to the lower level committee that will be dealing with day-to-day affairs. But that also is being pulled in every direction, and lots of countries, the Europeans want to have a say on it, and the Arab countries want to have a say on it. But you can only have probably 6 to 8 members, is what I'm being told, that will sit on this committee. But the longer this takes, the more Hamas is able to reassert its control in Gaza. And it seems like it's going to be at least several weeks until it gets up and running. And it was weird to hear how in the briefing with senior U.S. officials a couple days ago, was that they were arguing actually our priority is on other issues, that we're trying to focus on humanitarian aid, getting the bodies out, deconfliction. There's this U.S. deconfliction body that's being set up through CENTCOM. They're going to send 200 U.S. troops to try to make sure that the ceasefire is being upheld. So that's one of the other priorities that go ahead of this Palestinian Technocratic Committee. But without actually establishing an alternative in Gaza that can give Palestinians hope that there's a better option to Hamas, then there's no way to marginalize Hamas, and that they'll still be, Palestinians, I think, overwhelmingly in Gaza don't approve Hamas at this point. They see what the havoc it's wreaked, but I think they're more upset with Israel more, and therefore are willing to deal. They see Israel as, I think, primarily responsible for the destruction over the past 2 years, and therefore are willing to swallow this very poisonous pill of Hamas if that's the only option available to them at this point. So what the diplomats that I spoke with said is that that's why it's so important is not to delay on this issue, to move as quickly as possible, try to figure out a way to get everyone on board, or just forego the opinions of those who refuse to work quickly. As long as we can try to get something up and running that starts providing services to day-to-day services to Palestinians in Gaza, so that they don't need to rely on Hamas.
Okay. We will see if that is doable. Thank you, Jacob, for laying it all out for us.
Thanks, Jessica.
For sure. And thanks to you for listening to the Times Visual's Daily Briefing. Stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode is produced by the Podwaves. And any comments you have, drop us an email, podcast@timesvisual.com. Until next time, take care, be well, Shabbat Shalom.